Good evening, everyone. My name's Sophia Beach. I'm going to be chairing this evening's meeting on Marxism in an age of catastrophe. I'm really excited about our meeting tonight. I say good evening to all those who are watching here in the UK and in Europe. If you're tuning in from America, then good morning. I'm Sophia Beach. I'm going to be chairing the meeting today, as I said, and I hope that today is going to be an end to one of the better days in isolation. Hopefully we've all been enjoying the weather responsibly, and we can end up with an absolutely fantastic meeting this evening. We've got two brilliant speakers who I'll introduce very shortly. We're going to hear from both of them, and throughout the meeting there's going to be plenty of time for questions and contributions. So as normal, please share the stream with the hashtag health before profit, and please do contribute any questions or comments you may have in the comments section on Facebook below. This is a really brilliant opportunity to ask both of our speakers any questions that you may have about these very fast and uncertain times that we're living in. So first and foremost, our first speaker today is Alex Callinicos. He is an author of a number of books, including The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx. And we're very happy to have Mike Davis, who's tuning in with us from San Diego. Mike Davis is a historian based in the US, as I said, and he's again also an author of a number of books, including Planet of Slums, City of Courts, and also I should say that he wrote a book in 2005 called Monster at Our Door, which was one of the first books about avian flu, which is obviously extremely relevant to the crisis of corona and what we're going to be speaking about this evening. Alex is going to speak for about 10 minutes and Mike will speak for 25, and after which we'll have 2 rounds of questions. So like I said, please do keep commenting in the comment section below. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Alex Callinicos to give us a first 10-minute lead off on this meeting on Marxism in an age of catastrophe. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sophia. And hello, everyone, and particularly hello, Mike. It's great to see you, even if in this slightly strange virtual way, you in San Diego and me in Dalston, brought together by this ongoing and developing catastrophe. And I think this is, I really welcome the opportunity to talk to you about what's happening, because I think you're in many ways uniquely qualified to address the situation that we're in. And I say that for 3 reasons. First of all, I would say that one of the major themes of your writing, however diverse it is the relationship between capitalism and catastrophe. I mean, we've already had a reference to Monster at Our Door, which is a really prophetic work in the light of what we're now experiencing, warning of the flu pandemics. This one is coronavirus, not flu, but warning essentially of what we're now experiencing. But I think it's true of your work more broadly. I mean, there's your great book, Late Victorian Holocaust, which you only have to, the title speaks to itself about capitalism's destructive capability. But I'd like particularly to mention this book, Ecology of Fear, a really great book that you wrote in the late 1990s, which was about the imminence of supposedly natural disaster in Los Angeles, showing how fire and earthquake, all sorts of supposedly natural disasters are a consequence of the particular mode of capitalist development that has prevailed in Southern California. So I think your previous work has prepared you very well to address this situation. There's a secondary and related reason, which is that what's distinctive in when you address, what should we say, what you call in your book the dialectic of disaster, you probe the relationship between the political economy of capitalism as a highly contradictory, exploitive, and destructive mode of production driven by capital accumulation. You analyze the relationship between that and the behavior of complex physical systems that often work in a non-linear way. In other words, change isn't a simple gradual quantitative process, but you can have very dramatic leaps in the system. And it seems to me one of the main themes of your work is that the interaction between the system of capital accumulation and the physical systems in which human society is nested is becoming increasingly malign and destructive. And this is very important in understanding the pandemic. Um, um, Not just you, but the Marxist biologist Rob Wallace has shown very powerfully how capitalism's, in the way in which capitalism in the neoliberal era has penetrated more and more of the natural world and absorbed it in the process of capital accumulation, has created the conditions of the pandemic that we're now experiencing. But I think it's important to emphasize that you have the same kind of malign interplay as well in the process of climate change. That when it comes to climate change, one of the things that is beginning to develop in a really frightening way is the kind of feedback mechanisms that scientists have been warning us for years. In other words, that climate change produces effects that become self-reinforcing and produce yet more global warming and yet more effects destructive on both nature and human societies. Now, in your previous work, you've been largely warning us of catastrophes to come, and so have many other scholars and activists and so on been warning us about how this malign interaction of capitalism and physical systems would produce catastrophe. But now, the difference now is that the catastrophes are with us. The catastrophes are here. You talk about in your book on LA about the dialectic of ordinary disaster, but now we have a dialectic of extraordinary disaster. Think of the fires in the Amazon, the fires in Australia earlier this year, the floods in East Africa. When I was a child, because I was brought up in Zimbabwe, we used to go for holiday on the coast to Mozambique, to a port called Beira. I have many memories of childhood holidays spent there. A year ago, the East African floods destroyed Beira, a city of more than 100,000 inhabitants. So catastrophe is now, the catastrophes that you and others have warned us about are now with us, and we have this catastrophe that is working its way through the very centers of the system. I mean, it's remarkable that some of the cities that have been most gripped by the pandemic are major financial centers: Milan, London, and of course, in the most terrible way, New York. And I think this is the challenge that we face as Marxists today: how to confront a capitalism that is inflicting catastrophe in the here and now and threatening and destroying our lives. This brings me to the third theme, which is that of class. Now, you've written in a great and really illuminating way about the struggles of the working class in the United States, both historical struggles and contemporary struggles. And I think that means you bring a very important ingredient to the discussion that I don't think many other people could, because we see how this pandemic is all about class. Anyone who thought that we were living in a post-class or post-racial society just needs to look at how this pandemic has unfolded. They're all the ways in which our rulers created the conditions for this pandemic: cutting health care to the bone, refusing to allocate resources to plan for pandemics, refusing to confront the pandemic as it developed. And this is true particularly of our great leaders, your great leader, Donald Trump, and ours, Boris Johnson. And then as the pandemic unfolds, expecting huge numbers of workers to carry on workers and to pay the price in all sorts of different ways. Healthcare workers dying because of their exposure to the disease in hospitals and in care homes and so on. All the essential workers who are being forced to carry on. In Britain, 10 bus workers have died from COVID-19. The working poor who can't afford to stop working or to self-isolate. The informal workers in the planet of slums that you wrote so powerfully about again, another book, I think in 2005. You're such a you're such a prolific writer. The informal workers whose jobs just evaporated when the lockdown took place, and who in India are just expected to disappear. To get out of the way. The horrific figures about the way in which death is coded in class terms. Blacks and Latinos dying at twice the rate of white people in New York City. 72% of the deaths in Chicago from COVID-19 being deaths of African Americans. In this country, 3 million people, according to an article in the Financial Times today, are suffering from lack of food, often going without a meal in the course of a day because of the effects of the pandemic. This is a crisis that is ripping through the working class, and now we have the rush, both here and in the United States, to end the lockdowns as quickly as possible, risking many more deaths. Never in our lifetimes, I think, have we seen such a stark confrontation between life and profit. And I think this is what class politics is going to become: a desperate, bitter, mortal struggle to defend life against profit. That's it. Finished.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex, for that introduction. We're now going to pass straight over to Mike. I'd like to firstly quickly say that we've had over 550 people watching us currently online. So please do keep asking questions and comments that we're going to be able to ask both of our speakers after Mike's spoken. So over to you, Mike, for 25 minutes.
I'm delighted to be able to speak to so many comrades. And I thank you for inviting me to this meeting. In the broadest sense, capitalism is a threat, a mortal threat to human survival in 3 ways. First of all, it no longer creates jobs. It's made 1 billion people or more on this planet totally surplus to the needs of globalized production. Majority of people in Africa and in urban Africa and urban Latin America work in the informal sector. And that's basically the only sector in which jobs are created. Formal economy being, of course, a euphemism for subsistence by any means necessary. Secondly, of course, is climate change. Capitalism has propelled us into an entirely new geological epoch. And climate change, of course, has enormous consequences for disease. For instance, with warming, the key vectors of diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and so on are moving northward. And you'll see the reappearance of malaria, for example, in Europe is almost inevitable. In the Middle Ages, there was even malaria in England. But it has profound effects on disease and human health. And then thirdly, capitalism threatens our survival. because it directly unleashes, in fact, I would say it directly produces the kind of pandemics that we're in the midst of now. And remember, this isn't just a pandemic. We live in an age of pandemic and emergent diseases. So let me briefly indicate, and these are all obvious things, but the way in which capitalist globalization has produced these new plagues. The first thing, of course, is that it's destroyed the natural and social boundaries between humans and wild animal populations that formerly been very, very separated. Coronaviruses are mainly found in bats. That's the original reservoir. Bats, as we know, are incredibly reclusive. It takes a lot to bring humans in contact with bats or animals affected by bats. The driving force behind that has been the destruction of tropical forests by multinational logging companies, by clearance on a huge scale in the Amazon for corporate livestock production, raising beef for American hamburgers, and also by pushing so many rural people into desperation that's led to them trying to find their subsistence by taking down forests as well. So this has been a major force. I mean, there's a few years ago, some years ago, there was an incredible study done which showed the relationship between multinational fishing fleets, the emergence of new diseases in Africa, and human health in West Africa. And it's simply this, that previously in the Gulf of Guinea, along the coastline of West Africa, most protein came from fishing. And this was a huge industry carried out by small-scale fishermen. But from the 1980s onward, the factory fleets invaded the Gulf of Guinea, and they're estimated to have extracted about half of the protein in the Gulf, half of the fish stocks. So the small family fishermen basically were driven out of business. Food prices hiked. Concomitant with this, big multinational logging companies in Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, Gabon, and so on, as they were exploiting the last great virgin forest on Earth, decided to reduce labor costs by hiring hunters to provide meat for the logging camps. And ultimately, something like 70 different mammals and other animals became part of the diet. Now, because food prices were rising in West Africa, the wholesale food industry in West Africa and small retailers began to look to these hunters, and bushmeat became a staple in the diet of West Africa. And this is the chain of causation responsible both for the emergence of HIV and for Ebola. Then there's, of course, the question of factory farming, the industrialization, production of livestock and poultry. And I could drive now, about 8 hours, I'd be in Western Utah, and you can smell it from 10 miles away. It's a hog factory that has 100,000 animals at any particular time. Go to Arkansas, or for that matter, to Thailand, you'll find chicken plants that process 1 million chickens a year. And as Rob Wallace has written in his absolutely essential book on big farms, big flu, which is a study of industrialized agriculture. These are like particle accelerators for viral diseases. I mean, you could not design a machine that is more efficient at breeding new hybrids of viruses and distributing them. And right now, the new human coronavirus emerges after 2 or 3 years of worldwide destructive animal pandemics, also caused by coronavirus. And then finally, we have to turn to the most important fact of all, which is that in an immunological sense, there are two humanities. One humanity is well-fed, though it may suffer from obesity, is generally in good health and has access to medicine, not the kind of access that's necessary in some countries like the United States, but nonetheless access to hospitals and doctors. There's a second humanity, which depends on medical systems that were in large part destroyed in the 1980s and 1990s by debt, by structural adjustment, by the IMF's demand that countries reduce public spending or privatize public services. This was an absolute catastrophe for public health all through sub-Saharan Africa and in other countries as well. Sanitation is, on a global scale, the single biggest source of vulnerability to infectious disease. 1 billion people who don't have access to clean water and can't wash their hands with soap every hour like most of us are doing. The fecal contamination of the entire environments of slums. And of course, right now we stand at the edge of what could be the real massacre of this pandemic as it explodes in the slums of the global South. So it's impossible to imagine this just as something like an asteroid coming and hitting the Earth. This is a manufactured pandemic. It's a manufactured disease environment. Now, in the past, capitalism, and particularly globalized global capitalism, world trade, it depended on a modicum of investment in disease detection, early warning systems, and procedures to safeguard trade, safeguard health in the northern colonialist countries. And so modern international cooperation around disease emerged out of late Victorian imperialism, a whole series of international sanitary conferences. And their explicit aim, above all, was to be able to control infectious disease at the ports, to ensure the continuity of world trade. This was totally dominated by commercial motives. Similarly, with the founding of the World Health Organization in 1948, a dominant paradigm was the one that was generated or provided by the Rockefeller Foundation, which played an absolutely central role in the 1940s and 1950s. Its concern originally was to safeguard the health of plantation workers on United fruit company plantations and in Chilean nitrate mines. And its epistemology of disease was to concentrate on eliminating either the vector or the disease itself using DDT or vaccination. This proved to be incredibly successful in eliminating smallpox, but it's failed with virtually every other major disease that the World Health Organization has faced. Inside the World Health Organization, however, there were other voices, particularly from Latin America, where the pioneers of social medicine were people like Juan Justo, the founder of the Argentine Socialist Party, was a surgeon. And most importantly at all, a young Minister of Public Health, Minister of Health in the Popular Front government in Chile in 1939, named Salvador Allende, who wrote one of the most seminal books on public health in Latin America. So there was this alternative tradition which looked to treat the socioeconomic disease, not just to attempt to treat the wage war against the pathogen itself, but to look at the socioeconomic determinants, poverty, lack of sanitation, and so on. The story of the internal struggles within the World Health Organization are fascinating and very important. But for today, we have to face the fact that all the international infrastructure of disease detection and of internationally coordinated response, it's just fallen apart. The WHO has virtually collapsed. It's absolutely marginal role. In the first place, it's never been funded. Big countries like the United States have never come up to the honored the contributions they agreed to make. The WHO has had to turn mainly to lobbying the most powerful countries, the United States and China, and to philanthropies, which all this together provides 80% of their budget. And it's put the WHO in a position where it constantly is engaged in flattery and solicitation of the United States, of China, and of the philanthropies, which is become, in a way, almost ludicrously evident over the last 4 or 5 months as the Director General of WHO, pardon me for using an Americanism, is tried to kiss ass simultaneously in Beijing and Washington, while issuing massive amounts of misinformation. The American Center for Disease Control, which plays a large international role as well, and has been responsible for much of the early warning and detection of emerging diseases, is virtually collapsed too. In January, February, it decided not to use the test kits that have been developed by German pharmaceutical company for the World Health Organization that everybody else in the world is using, and develop its own test kit. Turned out it was flawed. It gave false results. And all of February was lost to it. The CDC, the American CDC, is headed by a right-wing fundamentalist Christian, and its budget was savagely cut by Trump, one of his first acts, and other agencies that provided disease detection were eliminated as well. The European Center for Disease Control, where's it been? as coronavirus devastated Italy and now Spain. It's been nowhere. The whole idea of the European Union is obviously in deep crisis. The expectation of, for instance, the Italians was that their European sisters, the other capitalist governments in Western Europe, would rush aid. Instead, Germany, Austria, France prohibited the export of crucial supplies and material, and basically left Italy out in the cold. Which brings us to another point, which is China obviously has exerted enormous economic influence. It's helped reshape the world economy over the last 20 years. But what China has lacked and most desperately seeking is soft power, is moral and political prestige through the world. Trump has totally abdicated any concept of American moral leadership or humanitarian response. So the Italians, not getting aid from France, turned to Beijing, which has been, provided absolutely crucial aid. It's been the forefront. Right now, there's only 2 countries in the world that are addressing the problem of this disease's spread in the global south: Cuba and its heroic doctors who are always at the front line of devastating outbreaks like Ebola, and has suffered a lot of casualties as a result. But China brings, of course, immense capacity to provide key medical supplies, expertise. And so it's everywhere on the ground where Europe and the United States are missing. I read an article recently about the 17th century, and the article is that the plagues of the 17th century, particularly their devastating impact on Italy, accelerated the transition from a Mediterranean-centered economy to a North Atlantic-centered economy. So we have to ask if COVID-19 is not accelerating a transition from American hegemony to Chinese hegemony. But finally, I have to ask this question: is capitalist globalization, and particularly value networks, the globalization of production, is it biologically sustainable? And this is a kind of open question in many ways, given that the response to the outbreak has been totally nationalist. To an extent, I think that has surprised most of the world leaders and nationalists themselves. International coordination is totally collapsed. So any recovery of globalized production depends on huge new efforts to create an international disease infrastructure. And this kind of takes the route of the Rockefeller position I was talking about in the 40s and 50s, where you attack the pathogen and ignore the social conditions that make people vulnerable. That is, in some ways, the ultimate causes of disease. But can it bring on the vaccines, the antivirals? So far, the private sector has been an immense obstacle to the conversion of the new technologies. There's a revolution in biological design. Now design proteins down to the atomic levels, next generation gene sequencing. But the potential of that, possibilities of it, have been blocked because, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, no longer produces the lifeline medicines whose production in the past has been their justification for their monopoly position in diseases. They don't make antivirals. They don't make, for the large part, vaccines, and they don't produce the new generation of antibiotics to face the global crisis of antibiotic-resistant viruses and I'm sorry, not viruses, bacteria in hospitals like staph or C. diff, which are killing hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. So they're in default. I mean, Big Pharma is basically a group of rentiers controlling patents, spending more on advertising than on research and in development. They've become not only a fetter on the medical revolution, scientific revolution, but through their price gouging and their enormous political lobbying against generic drugs. And I have to mention in this regard that one of the most important things that's happened from the progressive side of American politics is Elizabeth Warren has a bill for the public production, research, development, and production of lifeline medicines and prescription drugs at all, which seems to me to be something like the logic of socialism within the political economy of capitalism. But to end all this, so can global capital overcome its current nationalist fragmentation and create a infrastructure to deal with its major interests, which are the continuity of profits and globalized production, but it also has to meet the health needs of its own, of the metropolitan populations, because this is, of course, unleashed a global depression, a depression whose roots are not in disease itself. The disease is the detonator, but it's clear that there has to be an immense effort. Who's included and excluded from this? Well, there's no reason, if as long as the major capitalist countries believe that they can protect themselves in world trade through accelerated development of vaccines and antivirals and some new form of international public health organization, absolutely no interest whatsoever in dealing with what's always been the topic of social medicine, which is misery and poverty on a world scale. Will vaccines be available to all the populations of Africa and in South Asia? It's hard to see any reason, quite frankly, that they will be. I mean, if they're available, they'll come years later. So here we see globalized capitalism further deepening and widening the abyss between the two humanities. And of course, that's true inside our countries as well, where disease is, contoured itself to the legacy of racism and poverty in all the industrial countries. I think that right now, at least in my country, there's an extraordinary opportunity, however, not only to advance the progressive agenda of healthcare as a human right and Northern European style universal coverage, but demands which are essentially socialist, like to eliminate big pharma and nationalize the production of medicines. Amazon.com, which is emerging as the biggest single monopoly in world history, is now obvious to, I think, everyone that it's an essential utility, it's an essential infrastructure. And The progressive response to that is to break it up or tax it. But it creates a field in which we can raise the socialist demand, traditional socialist demand, make it a public utility, democratically administered and owned by society. So this crisis offers real opportunities to go beyond left reformism and raise genuinely socialist ideas and socialist demands.
Thank you so much there, both Mike and Alex. We're now going to move to the second half of our meeting where we have the opportunity to ask both of you questions. We've already had a number of them submitted, so I've got the first three here. I'm going to read them out relatively slowly, so hopefully if both speakers have a pen and paper, they can jot them down. And in terms of the order answering the questions, we're going to come to Alex first, then Mike, and then in the second round of the questions, we're going to reverse the order. So our first question is from Bella. Bella asks, the catastrophe is currently used to explain the worst impacts in society, for example, on renters or key workers, and thereby absolving capitalism of blame. How visible has it made the flaws of the system? That's our first question from Bella. Our second question is from Zoe. Zoe says, here in Philadelphia, USA, a video went viral yesterday of police assaulting a Black man on public transit for not having a mask. This catastrophe has given police extraordinary powers that, of course, they are using to oppress marginalized communities. How can we effectively resist this movement towards more militarized police when we cannot physically protest? That's the second question from Zoe. And our third and final question for this round is from Richard. Richard asks, we're seeing the breakdown of global supply chains, the reinforcement of the importance of state planning, and the accumulation of massive state debt. Are these trends going to lead us back to the sort of state capitalism? Are these trends going to lead us back to the sort of state capitalism we saw before the rise of neoliberalism? Have both speakers got all three of those questions? Good, perfect. So we're going to come over to you, Alex. And just before I pass over to you, I'd like to say both speakers have 5 to 7 minutes. And also we've reached over 750 people streaming across Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. So please do keep commenting and sharing as there's going to be more opportunities to ask questions. Alex.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to the questioners. In terms of Bella's question, yes, I think this catastrophe has exposed the flaws of the system very clearly. The way, I mean, I could give many examples, but the way in which public health has been stripped down to its most basic level. I mean, this is particularly extreme in the US because of the dominance of privatized healthcare, but we see this across Europe as well, in some of the richest societies on the planet. So I think it's thrown a very sharp light on everything that is wrong with capitalism, as Mike has so eloquently summarized. Secondly, in response to Zoe's question, I mean, there's also a video going viral of a couple of Black guys being not allowed to go into a supermarket because they were wearing face masks. So there they were being victimized for protecting themselves and so on. In other words, you know, the racism of the system means that if you're Black, whatever you do is wrong and you're going to be targeted. And this is an illustration of how all the flaws, the exclusions, the hierarchies of the system are expressed in particularly sharp form now. The pandemic has exposed the basic brutal of the system very, very sharply. What can we do about it? Well, we have to organize. And I think that, of course, it's true, it's hard to go out and demonstrate, but you know, thanks to Zoom and so on, we've had acquired this enormous resource of being able to meet and coordinate and discuss. That can become a platform for protest. And if this thing is going to go on, then we're going to have to learn how to organize via these kinds of media more and more. Already in Britain, the clapping for healthcare workers that takes place on Thursday evenings usually is an opportunity for demonstrations, you know, the stuff you hang out of your windows and so on and so forth. So there are resources for protest that one shouldn't underestimate. The final question about, I mean, in a way, I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way from the way in which the question was posed, because I think that behind this is really the question of what changes for the structure of capitalism will this pandemic produce. And there's already a tendency to repatriate, as it's put, supply chains, to bring them back at least closer to home, if not to home itself, in the case of some of the big economies in the US and in Europe. And I think this will intensify when it comes, for example, to medical supply chains. You know, there are all these Trump people who are terrified of the thought of being dependent on China. But I think it's very hard for the system to go without a manager, a dominant capitalist state that organizes it as a whole. And even in the era of quasi-state capitalism after the Second World War, the US was the manager. And I think it's very significant that in this crisis, the US has partially retreated from that role. I mean, Trump is not willing, or his administration are not willing to take on the generalized responsibility for managing the system that every post-war US president before him was willing to do. And this helps to explain the anarchic reaction of states to what's happening that Mike talked about, the competition for medical supplies and so on and so forth. The US hasn't completely abdicated. And we see the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, acting as it did in 2007-8 as the manager and protector of the global financial system. But this is a role that it can, that's an attempt to stabilize the chaos, but it's only a partial way of doing it. Just 2 points I want to make in conclusion. We can't forget about the impact of the crash and the global financial crisis, because that produced Trump. Trump came out of the crisis of 2007 and 8 and the reaction to it. He was able to exploit it. His solution is America first, to retreat into economic nationalism. And this is destabilizing the system. The problem is that I don't think that there's any other state that is capable of taking on that role of manager. It's true that China is probably going to come out of this with more soft power, as Mike said, because of its ability to, as far as we can tell, to get control of the pandemic after initially making a number of very bad mistakes. But I don't think China's has the ability to manage the system, partly because of the role of the Fed and of the US dollar as the apex of the financial system, which, as we all know, plays an extraordinarily important role in contemporary neoliberal capitalism. So I think that what we're going to get out of the pandemic, even when at least some of us become safer than we are now, let's put it in those very cautious terms, is more instability and more chaos at the level of the system. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex. That was very clear and very succinct answers to the questions. Same amount of time for you, Mike, and the same 3 questions. So over to you.
Let me work backward from Alex's last points. One of the strangest structural aspects of the American economy at this point is that the most politically consequential and influential sectors of capital are not the most powerful. They're not multinational corporations. And even within the financial system, it tends not to be the great banks, but often the hedge funds and private equity companies, the real predators in the system. But if you look at who supports Trump, who's in his cabinet, we're talking about people who like have medium-sized oil and gas companies, or are the biggest business in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so on. So Marx's analysis, at least of this country, has to explain why the kind of unified ruling class initiative in the 1970s that launched a crusade against labor, that used Reagan to reshape the American economy. But it was central to something called the Business Roundtable, and this was the Fortune 500. There may not be something like a Fortune 500 at all today. And that's something that requires explanation and understanding. And it also is directly related to the managerial role on a global scale that Alex was talking about. Some of the actions that America is able to take and other countries in the world, even China, are particularly at the level of the hegemony of the dollar. The dollar is the base currency still of international trade. So right now, the Federal Reserve is printing money as fast as it can. But there's also an implosion into the United States of other currency. Everybody's trying to convert their monetary holdings and so on into dollars, because dollars are obviously the safest bolt hole for creditors. But the impact of that is to greatly increase the real value of debt in the rest of the world. And we're seeing the beginning of a new international debt crisis that stems precisely from this American centrality and the dollar centrality to the world economy, when at the same time other supports of American hegemony are decaying. Now, is the exposure to the fault lines and class divisions of society. In the United States right now, you're seeing the beginning of a really large upsurge of labor. And it's happening across the board, and all the sectors were involved in meeting the pandemic. The National Nurses Unity, our nurses union, which has been the major union supporter of the Sanders campaign, is, I think if you were to use a very old-fashioned term and say, what's the vanguard of the proletariat right now? Well, it's the increasingly radicalized ranks of healthcare workers, not just nurses, of course, but attendants, janitors. And it's also unleashed the beginning of protests by warehouse workers, postal workers. So I think you're going to see a major upsurge in American labor, and same time a radicalization of these ranks. And of course, this is all in the context of a radicalization of a generation that I don't think anybody could have predicted 10 years ago. And if you look at the base of the Sanders campaign, it's not simply that a majority of young Americans now prefer socialism to capitalism when polled about it, but there's so many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, have voted with their feet. And if Sanders concedes the nomination, it of course is immensely important that he doesn't concede the struggle. And the pandemic has provided a new and more radical framework for the campaign. And, you know, in activities of the left in general, as I say, it raises the potential not only to demand what are essentially New Deal type demands, but to pose openly socialist solutions. So I think that in the United States, at least, far from quelling or suppressing popular movements and class organizations, the pandemic's going to have the opposite effect, and it will sharpen class struggle, and in this country, I believe.
Thank you very much, both Mike and Alex. We're now going to have another round of 3 questions. This is unfortunately going to be our final round to make sure that we can finish by 8:15. I'm sure the viewers and everybody else would like to hear endless amounts of questions for both of you. So our first question is from Fernandina. Fernandina asks, how do you account for the apparent generalized lack of preparedness for the pandemic on the part of the leadership in virtually all countries? Our second question is from Doug. This is just off the back of what you just finished off saying, Mike. Doug asks, should Sanders have held off before suspending his campaign? Or will doing this make it harder or easier to be part of the national debate in the States regarding how workers fight back over COVID-19? And our final question is from Chuck. It's a short question with what I presume may not be a very short answer. Chuck asks, what are the political tasks of Marxists in the context of the pandemic and its aftermath? So for this round of questions, you're going to have the same amount of time, 5 to 7 minutes, but I'm going to reverse the order. So if that's okay with both speakers, I'm going to call Mike first, and then we're going to go to Alex. So Mike, over to you.
Okay, could you remind me the first question?
One second. Sorry, the first question from Fernandina is, how do you account for the apparent generalized lack of preparedness for the pandemic on the part of the leadership in virtually all countries? Is that okay, Mike?
That's okay. And the answer to that question is there is no lack of preparation. On the contrary, on paper at least, virtually every year you received world leaders in all the countries were warned by their scientific community, by their public health offices, by their ministries of health. And even in the case of the United States, the Council of Economic Advisors, Trump's own economic advisors, told him a year ago that there was an imminent threat of pandemic. I mean, echoing what's been said for 15 years. And they also pointed out that the private pharmaceutical sector would be unable to supply the antivirals and vaccines that would be needed. It's been long pointed out the shortfall in supplies, the running down of the national strategic stockpile of it. New agencies and programs have been set up to provide early warning and early response, particularly by the Obama administration, which also, of course, responded with a big campaign and 3,000 American troops in West Africa for Ebola. And the same's true of virtually every major nation. So there's been constant warnings, constant preparations. But of course, what hasn't happened is the implementation of that. And in the case of the United States and the Trump administration, from the very moment of his inauguration, he started to dismantle the organizations and reverse the policies that have been created specifically to deal with a pandemic. For instance, Obama had a pandemic planning group as part of his National Security Council. Trump fired them all. And he put national health, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control and so on, in the hands of people whose major qualification was simply loyalty to him. So the monster that stepped through our door could not be more familiar. We've known about it for more than 20 years. We've all seen the movies, we've all read the books, and if anyone paid attention, should have heard the warnings that were made as well. So there was nothing really unexpected about this. It was, if anything, an almost constant refrain in the background. So that leads you then to explore reasons why leadership so drastically failed. And in the Anglo-Saxon countries, of course, you see the neoliberalism at its worst. And now a new nationalism whose major objective is to continue the destruction of public sector and public health. Trump's used every opportunity in this crisis to push forward the agendas of various industries and financial bankers. Environmental regulations have been suspended, for instance, on public lands. The so-called $2 trillion legislation that was just passed, half of it just as special interest, a donation by the Trump administration to industries that don't really need it at all. And Democrats went along with it because the only way they could get any support, income maintenance for workers. Socialists, I believe, in this crisis must first of all, in every way, express solidarity and give active support to health workers and all the other people who are going to work and unprotected in this country, without masks, without surgical gloves. Just talking to my mail carrier, he's a great guy. And he's been issued absolutely nothing. The same for the warehouse workers. My wife, who's an artist, last week spent several days with some other artist friends making surgical masks. Trump gets up and says, this is the most advanced, scientifically and technologically advanced country in the face of the earth. And the same day, the New York Times has to print instructions on how to sew surgical masks. Going back to this is the handicraft, mode of production. And I think that after the first priority of supporting, the working class and the revolt that's beginning to take place against the unsafe conditions, has to be to directly address. In fact, I shouldn't say this isn't second. This should probably be first. Address the hotspots where large numbers of people are at risk of death. Nursing homes, prisons, detention camps, refugee settlements. We need to move people out of prisons. We need to move people out of rest homes. And we should do, and what socialists should be demanding, is what's happened in Portugal, where the left coalition basically gave citizens' rights to everybody in the country, regardless of their legal status, regardless of the fact that they were refugees, and so on. That should be a kind of universal model, I think, for the left.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And once again, thank you so much again for joining us. I'm going to pass straight on to Alex to give us the final word and his take on the previous 3 questions. So, Alex.
Okay, I also want to start by commenting on something that Mike said in his answer to the first round of questions, where he talked about in the US the disconnect between, if you like, the core of American capital, the big multinational corporations and banks, and the Trump administration, and that being a problem that Marxists have to address. Now, it's very important to see that we have the same in Britain. This is brought out by Brexit. You know, what is Johnson's great achievement, or what it was before this disaster, was to actually, as he famously put it, or promised to get Brexit done. But Brexit was not something that the key elements of big capital that dominate the British economy wanted. I mean, many of these corporations in any case were German or Japanese. Same's true of the city or American. They didn't want Brexit. They didn't want Britain to separate from the European Union. Yet, you know, the Tories, the historical party of big business in this country, implemented that. So we see, I mean, to put it in Marxist terms, a kind of misalignment between the political superstructure, the state, and, you know, the structure of capitalist economic power. And I think this shows how the global financial crisis disorganized the major ruling classes. In Europe, it takes a more, in the Eurozone, it takes a more territorial form of the conflicts, in particular between the North European states, led by Germany, and the South, led by particularly France and Italy at the present time. But in the background to all this are the disorganizing effects of the global financial crisis, which I think it's very important to understand. Now, on Chuck's question, you know, what are the political tasks for Marxists in the pandemic? I put it very simply. The task of Marxists today, wherever they are, is to be in the forefront of the fight for life against profits. And that means defending, campaigning in support not just of healthcare workers, but all the other so-called essential workers, like postal workers that Mike was talking about, who are so exposed, the delivery workers, and so on and so forth. Find ways of giving solidarity with them, of working with them. I mean, you know, we hear in Britain the same kind of stories that Mike is talking about, that the trade union leaders, on the whole, are completely useless faced with this crisis. They've just capitulated to all the rhetoric of the national interest and being involved in a common national effort to combat the pandemic and all that sort of nonsense. But in the workplaces, workers who are hit in as huge numbers are in different ways by the pandemic, critically with the issue of safe working. There are lots and lots of fights going on, and the job of Marxists is to be, as far as we can, to be in the lead of the fight to defend life against profits, and the fight for solidarity on a much broader human basis, not just the solidarity of particular groups of workers, but the solidarity of the entire working population of the world against the people who've inflicted this horror on us. And I think, I feel torn. In one way, I feel quite optimistic, because there was an article that a friend drew my attention to on Bloomberg the other day, saying that workers are discovering their power in this crisis, because now we realize, you know, it's not just a question of rhetoric, it's not even a moral thing. We realize how much we depend on not just the nurses and doctors, but the people who stack shelves in the supermarkets, the delivery van drivers, the postal workers, all these people who are generally low pay, low status workers. I mean, it varies from section to section, but it's true, particularly workers in the logistics industry, for example, are critical to our daily survival. We can't get on without these people. I mean, as Marxists, we always knew this, but this is now a very, very stark reality. And the Bloomberg article was saying that those workers now have seen their power enhanced by the crisis, although at the same time, the effects of the economic crisis, the huge rise in unemployment, will strengthen the hand of the employers in putting pressure on workers. So there's the beginning, I think, of very big class battles taking place. This makes me optimistic, but I think one has to add the element of, Mike talked about the ecology of fear of death, of the every day in this country, 1,000 people die because of the pandemic, largely unnecessarily. Because of the kind of rulers that we have and the system that we have. Death is stalking the streets of every city in the world, and is stalking increasingly will penetrate the countryside. So we are facing a really mortal threat. And I remember the title of an old book by Norman O. Brown, Love Against Death, that I think Herbert Marcuse, who was someone who Mike has had something to do, used to cite. And in a way, that's where we are. Love, life against death, that capitalism increasingly represents a force, a death-inflicting force. And we have to fight it with all our strength.
Thank you very much, Alex. I like the Marcuse reference there at the end. Just to finish, I'd like to thank both of our speakers once again for tuning in. Thank you to all of those who shared the stream and watched online. I'm really happy to say that by the end of it, we had over 800 views across all social media platforms. So I'm sure we can all be really pleased with that. And also just to briefly say to people, if you did miss the beginning of the video, it will be available very shortly after we finish live streaming on both our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, SWP TV UK. On those channels, you'll also be able to find previous live streams that we've been doing during the time of the pandemic. And I'd like to just quickly make a little plug about Bookmarks Bookshop. Both speakers that we've been listening to tonight, and also many of our previous speakers on our live streams, are all authors of really brilliant, fantastic books that can arm you with the knowledge that and the politics we need to get through this crisis. And Bookmarks Bookshop, although closed, is still doing online mail delivery. So please do visit their website at www.bookmarksbookshop.co.uk and have a little look. If you're really keen, you can buy some books on the website by John Bellamy Foster, who we're incredibly happy to be having a live stream with next week on Marxism and ecology in the time of pandemics. Please give us a like on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram to keep up to date with that, as more details are going to be confirmed. And I'd just like to finish really by saying that if you've tuned into our streams before, or if this is the first time streaming and you agree with the politics and what's been said by both speakers, then please do consider joining the Socialist Workers' Party. I think in operating during this weird time, we've all learned a lot of new things in how we organise. And I think one of the things that's very stark is that you don't have to be physically on the streets or at a protest to get involved and get stuck in with political activity. There are weekly meetings just like this in local branches that you can get stuck into, and there are also many support groups and local socialists and activists that are very happy to work with you. So please do think about joining us. The link is in the event description. And I'd just like to say thank you once again to both our speakers. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Hopefully we'll see you next week, and in the meantime, please do stay safe and stay socialist. So thank you very much.